September 12, 1966, Phuoc Tuy Province, Vietnam. Deep in the jungle where the canopy blocks even the sun. A Viet Cong patrol, 15 men armed with AK-47s, moves through their own territory. Ground they've controlled for months, ground they know by heart. They walk with confidence. The jungle is their fortress, every ambush site memorized, every trail trapped. No enemy has ever surprised them here. Their commander stops, raises his hand. Something is wrong. The jungle has gone silent. No birds, no insects. Just nothing. He scans the tree line, sees only green, hears only his own breath, then realizes they are being watched. Right now. From somewhere within 20 meters. 6 Australian soldiers, SASR operators who have been tracking them for 3 hours, close enough to count the rounds in their magazines, close enough to hear them breathe, yet not a single branch has moved, not one leaf has rustled. The Viet Cong would later have a name for these men. Ma Rung, phantoms of the jungle. What happened next would change how the Viet Cong fought, and feared, for the rest of the war. Subscribe for more untold war stories. The jungle in Phuoc Tuy Province was not like any battlefield Lieutenant David Williams had trained for. It was a living, breathing thing that tried to kill you slowly, through exhaustion, dehydration, infection from a single scratch, or the heat that turned a man's brain to soup inside his helmet. The triple canopy rainforest blocked out 90% of the sunlight, leaving the ground in permanent twilight even at noon. Visibility rarely exceeded 10 meters. Sound traveled strangely here, bouncing off tree trunks and vines until you could never be certain where a footstep originated. This was September 1966, and Williams was leading one of the first Australian SASR patrols into what the Americans called Indian country. 6 men. That was the entire patrol. Williams at point, Sergeant Jack Smith covering rear security, Corporal Brian Johnson handling communications and demolitions, and 3 more operators whose names would never appear in official histories. They carried L1A1 SLR rifles, 7.62mm, 20-round magazines, effective to 600 meters if you could see that far, which you never could in this green hell. Each man carried 3 magazines plus 1 in the weapon, 80 rounds total. After that, you were fighting with your knife or running. They moved with packs stripped down to 24 hours of rations, 2 canteens, medical kit, and ammunition. No tents, no sleeping bags, nothing that rattled, clinked, or reflected light. Their uniforms were faded green, stained with red mud and sweat until they matched the jungle floor perfectly. The difference between life and death in this environment came down to one thing: noise discipline. The Viet Cong owned this jungle. They had fought here for 20 years, first against the French, now against the Americans and their allies. They knew every trail, every water source, every hiding spot. They could move through the undergrowth like smoke through a screen door. Or so they believed. What the VC did not know was that the Australian SAS had spent the previous 6 months training specifically for this terrain. Not in Vietnam, in the rainforests of Queensland and Malaysia. They had learned to walk differently. Heel down first, rolling to the toe, testing each step before committing weight. They learned to read the jungle's sounds, to know when the birds stopped singing because of your presence or because of something else. They practiced until a 6-man patrol could move through dense bush for hours without creating a single sound that did not belong to the forest itself. Williams held up a closed fist. The patrol froze mid-step. He had spotted something 30 meters ahead, a disturbance in the natural pattern of vegetation. Not obvious, just a branch bent at an angle that did not match the others around it. He studied it for 2 full minutes while sweat ran down his face and soaked his collar. Mosquitoes landed on his neck and drank. He did not move to brush them away. Finally, he identified it. A trail marker. The VC used broken branches and arranged leaves to mark their routes through the jungle, codes that meant nothing to outsiders but everything to their own people. This marker indicated a trail junction lay ahead. Williams hand-signaled to Smith. The patrol moved forward at a pace that would have driven conventional infantry insane. 15 meters in 10 minutes. But they made no sound whatsoever. The trail itself was barely visible, just a slight depression in the jungle floor where countless feet had compressed the soil over months or years. Williams knew from intelligence briefings that this area was a major infiltration route. The VC used it to move supplies from their base camps to forward positions near Nui Dat, where the Australian task force had established its headquarters. Disrupting these supply lines was the entire point of SASR operations. Find them, watch them, report back. Occasionally, if the opportunity presented itself and the odds were acceptable, engage and withdraw. The Australian commanders had learned from American mistakes. They were not interested in body counts or territorial control. They wanted intelligence and disruption. The SAS was their scalpel, not their hammer. Johnson tapped Williams on the shoulder and pointed to fresh footprints in a patch of exposed mud. Maybe 6 hours old. A group of at least 10 men, judging by the number of distinct prints, all heading north. Williams checked his map, a hand-drawn affair based on aerial photography and previous patrol reports, since the official maps were nearly useless in this terrain. North would take the VC toward a suspected base camp that intelligence had identified but never confirmed. This was exactly the kind of information command needed. He signaled the patrol to follow the trail at a distance, paralleling it but staying 15 meters to the side in thicker cover. They moved for 3 more hours as the jungle transitioned from green twilight to complete darkness. Night comes fast in the tropics, no long sunset, just a sudden drop into blackness. The patrol stopped and established a harbour position, a defensive circle where they would spend the night without fire, without talking, without moving, unless absolutely necessary. Each man ate cold rations in silence, chewing slowly to avoid any sound. They took turns on watch in 2-hour shifts. The jungle at night was loud with insects, frogs, and the occasional scream of some animal dying in the darkness. But human sounds were different. Human sounds had rhythm and purpose that stood out against the chaos of nature. At 03:30, Smith heard it. Voices, very faint, coming from the north. Vietnamese words he could not understand, but recognized by their tonal quality. He touched Williams's arm in the darkness. The lieutenant was awake instantly, no grogginess, no confusion. SASR training had taught him to sleep like a cat, deeply but ready to explode into action within seconds. He listened. The voices were moving closer, not toward the patrol specifically, but along the trail they had been following earlier. The VC were moving at night, which meant they felt secure, overconfident. That was a mistake. Williams made a decision. Instead of withdrawing, which would have been the safe option, he positioned his patrol for observation. They became part of the jungle floor, motionless, barely breathing, weapons ready but not aimed. The VC patrol passed within 20 meters. Williams counted them by sound and occasional glimpses through the undergrowth. 15 men, maybe 16. They carried AK-47s and moved with casual confidence, talking in normal voices, not bothering with noise discipline. Why would they? This was their jungle. No enemy had ever penetrated this deep without being detected first. Except the Australians had been here for hours. Watching, listening, learning. And the Viet Cong had no idea they were 20 meters from death. The patrol that passed Williams's position that night never made it to their destination. 3 days later, an Australian airstrike destroyed the supply cache they had been guarding, based on coordinates Williams radioed back to Nui Dat. The Viet Cong lost 8 tons of rice, 200 rounds of mortar ammunition, and a cache of medical supplies they could not replace. They also lost something more valuable, their sense of security. Someone had been watching them. Someone had penetrated deep into their controlled territory, without being detected. The question of who and how began to eat at local VC commanders like a fever they could not cure. Williams's patrol had been extracted by helicopter on day 7, covering nearly 80 kilometers on foot through some of the densest jungle in Southeast Asia. They had observed 4 separate VC movements, identified 3 previously unknown trails, and confirmed the location of 2 base camps. Not a single shot fired, not a single Australian casualty. Command was impressed, but Williams knew the real test was still coming. Observation was one thing, direct action was something else entirely. The SASR was not in Vietnam to watch. They were here to kill, disrupt, and disappear before the enemy could respond. The opportunity came in October. Intelligence reported a VC supply convoy moving through a valley approximately 15 kilometers southwest of Nui Dat. The convoy consisted of perhaps 20 porters carrying supplies on bicycles modified to haul up to 200 kilograms each. These bicycles were one of the VC's secret weapons, simple, silent, able to navigate trails where vehicles could not go. A single bicycle convoy could move enough ammunition to sustain a battalion for weeks. Destroying one was worth 10 firefights. Williams drew the assignment along with a second SASR patrol led by Lieutenant Mark Thompson. 12 men total, split into 2 groups that would establish an L-shaped ambush at a predetermined point along the convoy route. The plan was simple in concept, but demanded perfect execution. Williams's team would trigger the ambush from the long side of the L, firing down the length of the convoy. Thompson's team would form the short side, blocking the enemy's escape route and catching anyone who tried to break contact. The ambush would last no more than 30 seconds. Then both patrols would withdraw in opposite directions to pre-planned extraction points where helicopters would be waiting. They inserted by helicopter at dusk, 4 kilometers from the ambush site. The Hueys came in low and fast, barely hovering before the SASR operators jumped into waist-high elephant grass. The helicopters were gone within 15 seconds, leaving only the fading thump of rotors and the smell of aviation fuel. The 2 patrols split immediately, moving toward their positions along different routes to avoid creating an obvious trail. Williams estimated they had 9 hours to reach the ambush point, establish positions, and wait for dawn when the convoy was expected to pass. The movement was agony. Every step had to be tested. Every branch moved aside with infinite care and released slowly so it would not snap back. They crossed 2 streams by wading through the water rather than using obvious crossing points where the VC might have planted mines or established observation posts. By 0300, Williams's patrol was in position on a slight rise overlooking the trail. Thompson's team reported via radio a single burst of static clicks, no voice transmission, that they were also set. The jungle before dawn is colder than most people expect. Williams lay in the prone position, his SLR aimed down at the trail 12 meters below, and tried to ignore the cold water seeping through his uniform from the damp ground. Johnson was on his left with the M60 machine gun, the big weapon that would do most of the killing once the ambush was triggered. Smith was on the right with the radio, ready to call in the extraction helicopters the moment they broke contact. The other 3 operators were spaced at 5-meter intervals, each covering a specific sector of fire. They had been motionless for 3 hours now, not sleeping, not relaxing, just existing in that state of controlled alertness that separates professional soldiers from everyone else. The convoy appeared at 0645, just as the morning mist was beginning to burn off. Williams heard them before he saw them, the quiet squeak of bicycle chains that needed oil, the shuffle of feet on packed dirt, low voices speaking in Vietnamese. Then they materialized out of the grey dawn like ghosts made solid. 23 men, each pushing a bicycle loaded with supplies covered by woven mats. They moved in single file, spaced about 3 meters apart. No security element out front, no rear guard. Just laborers doing a job they had done dozens of times before on a trail they believed was safe. Williams waited until 18 of the 23 were inside the kill zone. His finger rested on the trigger. His breathing was slow and controlled. Everything depended on the next 5 seconds. He aimed at the man in the center of the convoy and squeezed. The SLR kicked against his shoulder, its 7.62mm round covering 12 meters in a fraction of a second and punching through the target's chest. Before the man hit the ground, Johnson opened up with the M60. The machine gun fired at a rate of 550 rounds per minute, which translated to pure violence at close range. Tracers lit up the morning mist every fifth round, red streaks that seemed to bend the air itself. The other SASR operators fired in controlled bursts, 2 to 3 rounds per target, exactly as trained. The sound was enormous in the confined space of the jungle valley, a continuous roar that sent birds exploding from the canopy and made the ground itself seem to shake. The VC convoy disintegrated, men fell, bicycles crashed, supplies scattered across the trail. A few tried to run back the way they had come, directly into Thompson's blocking position. His team cut them down with short, precise bursts. The entire engagement lasted 28 seconds from first shot to last. Then silence. The kind of silence that feels unnatural after that much noise. Williams's ears were ringing. Cordite smoke drifted through the trees, mixing with the morning mist. On the trail below, nothing moved. He counted bodies. 19 visible, which meant 4 had either escaped or were hiding. No time to search. He hand-signaled the withdrawal. The patrol melted back into the jungle, moving rapidly now that stealth no longer mattered. Behind them, they left 30 VC dead or wounded, 23 bicycles destroyed, and enough supplies to feed a company for 2 weeks burning in piles that Thompson's team had ignited with thermite grenades. The helicopters picked them up 8 minutes later at a clearing 1 kilometer east. As the Huey lifted off, Williams looked back at the smoke rising from the valley. He knew what would happen next. The VC would find that ambush site and try to understand what had hit them. They would find Australian shell casings and realize their enemy could move through the jungle as silently as they did. They would find the speed and violence of the attack impossible to reconcile with their understanding of how Western soldiers fought. And they would begin to fear the shadows in ways they never had before. The Viet Cong called them Ma Rừng within 2 weeks of the convoy ambush. Phantoms of the jungle. The name spread through VC units operating in Phuoc Tuy province like a disease, carried in whispered conversations and nervous glances at the tree line. Local commanders began filing reports that described encounters with an enemy that seemed to violate the basic rules of warfare. Australian soldiers who could approach within meters without being heard. Ambushes that erupted from positions the VC had walked past hours earlier without detecting anything. Patrols that vanished after contact so completely that tracking them was impossible. The reports reached D445 Battalion headquarters in late October, and the senior leadership faced an uncomfortable truth. They were no longer the apex predators in their own territory. Captain Nguyen Van Tan commanded a reinforced company of 120 men, veterans who had survived years of combat against the French and then the Americans. He was not a man prone to superstition or fear, but even he could not ignore what was happening. In the last month, his area of operations had seen 7 successful ambushes against VC logistics units. 43 men killed, 62 wounded, and supplies worth thousands of dollars destroyed. More disturbing was what his men were reporting from the field. They described walking past positions where Australian soldiers later revealed themselves to have been hiding. One patrol claimed they had eaten lunch 10 meters from an enemy observation post they never detected. Another reported finding boot prints that appeared and disappeared, as if the men who made them had simply floated through the jungle. Than held a commanders' meeting in early November at a camp hidden deep in the jungle near the Rang Rang River. The gathering itself was risky. 20 officers in one place made a valuable target, but the situation demanded coordination. The camp consisted of nothing more than a few lean-tos covered with vegetation and a cooking area where fires were only lit at dusk when the smoke would dissipate in the darkness. Than studied the faces around him and saw something he had never seen before in these hardened fighters. Uncertainty. They were beginning to doubt their own skills, questioning whether the jungle they had mastered was still theirs to control. He spread a hand-drawn map on the ground and used a stick to point out the pattern of Australian attacks. The ambushes were not random. They followed the major infiltration routes his forces used to move supplies from Cambodia to positions near the coast. The Australians were targeting the logistics network with surgical precision, which meant they had excellent intelligence. But intelligence alone did not explain how six-man patrols could penetrate so deeply without being detected. Than's reconnaissance units had increased their own patrols, trying to locate the Australian positions before attacks occurred. They had found nothing. It was as if the Ma Rung existed in some parallel version of the jungle that overlapped with their own but remained invisible. The solution, Than decided, was to change how his forces operated. If the Australians were monitoring the major trails, then new trails would be cut through areas previously considered too difficult to traverse. If they were attacking supply convoys, then convoys would move in smaller groups with heavy security elements front and rear. Most importantly, VC patrols would adopt the same noise discipline the Australians were using. They would move slowly, deliberately, treating every meter of jungle as potentially hostile territory. It was a fundamental shift in doctrine, an admission that the VC no longer owned the battlefield by default. The new tactics were implemented immediately, and for 3 weeks they seemed to work. VC supply movements continued without incident. Patrols reported no Australian contact. Than began to believe they had adapted successfully, that the threat had been contained through superior tactical thinking. Then, in late November, everything fell apart in a single morning that would define the rest of the campaign. A VC supply depot near the village of Hoalong held enough ammunition, food, and medical supplies to sustain operations for 2 months. The depot was carefully hidden in a network of underground bunkers covered by triple canopy jungle. Only a handful of commanders knew its exact location. Security was maintained by a platoon of 40 men who rotated shifts around the perimeter. Approach routes were booby-trapped with grenades rigged to tripwires and punji pits covered with leaves. The depot had existed for 18 months without ever being compromised. Than considered it the safest location in the province. Williams's patrol had been observing the depot for 6 days. They had inserted far to the west and moved into position over 72 hours, covering less than 10 kilometers total. The approach was so slow that at times they moved only 50 meters in an hour, testing every step, avoiding the obvious trails, navigating by compass through vegetation so thick that visibility was measured in arm lengths. They found the depot not through intelligence reports but through basic fieldcraft, following the trails backward from known VC activity areas, looking for patterns in movement that indicated a central hub. The observation post Williams selected was a cluster of fallen trees 30 meters upslope from the main bunker complex. From this position, they could see the entrance, count the guards, and monitor the entire operation without being detected. They watched the VC security patrols walk past their position multiple times, so close that Williams could have reached out and touched them. The guards never looked up, never suspected that Australian soldiers were lying motionless in the rotting vegetation just meters away. Why would they? This was the heart of their territory, protected by layers of security and jungle that no enemy could penetrate. On day 6, Williams called in the strike. He used a burst transmission on his ANPRC-25 radio, a 15-second broadcast that sent encrypted coordinates to an artillery battery at Nui Dat. The radio operator there confirmed reception and passed the fire mission to the gun crews. At 08:30, the first round impacted directly on the main bunker entrance. The 105mm high-explosive shell buried itself 3 feet into the earth before detonating, the explosion channeling down into the underground complex like water down a drain. 14 more rounds followed over the next 3 minutes, walking across the depot area in a pattern that collapsed bunkers, detonated stored ammunition, and sent secondary explosions rippling through the complex. Williams watched through binoculars as the VC security force scrambled in chaos, unable to identify where the attack was coming from or how to respond. Some ran toward the bunkers trying to save supplies. Others scattered into the jungle, abandoning their positions. A few returned fire in random directions, shooting at nothing. The entire depot was burning now, ammunition cooking off in staccato bursts that sounded like popcorn. Black smoke rose through the canopy, a column visible for kilometers that announced to everyone in the province that something catastrophic had occurred. The patrol withdrew during the chaos, moving with the same methodical care they had used to approach. They were 2 kilometers away before the first VC reinforcements arrived at the burning depot. By the time those reinforcements organized a search, Williams's team was being extracted by helicopter from a clearing 5 kilometers distant. The VC never found their observation post. They never discovered how the Australians had obtained the coordinates for a depot whose location was supposed to be secret. And they never understood how 6 men had spent 6 days within meters of their security patrols without being detected even once. The success at Hoalong created pressure for more operations, faster rotations, deeper penetrations. Williams felt it in the mission briefings at Nui Dat, where Captain Richardson outlined increasingly ambitious targets. The SASR had proven their methods worked, which meant command wanted to exploit that advantage before the enemy adapted. It was sound military logic, but Williams understood something the staff officers did not. The jungle was not a machine you could run at maximum capacity indefinitely. It extracted a price for every hour spent in its depths, and that price compounded with each mission until men started making mistakes born of exhaustion and frayed nerves. His patrol went back out in mid-December with orders to locate and observe a suspected VC battalion headquarters near the Suoi Dabang River Valley. The intelligence was thin, radio intercepts suggesting command-level communications in that area, reports from informants about increased activity, nothing concrete. They would be operating 30 kilometers from Nui Dat, beyond the range of effective artillery support if things went wrong. The extraction plan called for helicopter pickup at one of 3 predetermined landing zones, but those zones were 45 minutes flying time from the nearest firebase. If they made contact and needed emergency extraction, they would be on their own for at least that long. The insertion went smoothly. They infiltrated at dusk on December 14th, moving immediately into the dense jungle west of the landing zone. Williams had a bad feeling about the mission from the start, though he could not articulate why. Perhaps it was the weather, a storm system moving in from the coast that would reduce helicopter operations. Perhaps it was the patrol composition. Johnson had been replaced by a newer operator named Davis, who was competent but lacked the intuitive understanding of jungle work that came from months of experience. Or perhaps Williams was simply tired. He had run 4 operations in the last 6 weeks with minimal rest between them. His sleep was fragmented by dreams of men dying in ambushes he should have prevented. They spent 3 days moving toward the target area, covering perhaps 8 kilometers. The terrain was worse than expected, steep ravines cutting through the jungle, forcing them to detour around obstacles that did not appear on their maps. Water sources were scarce. By day 4, they were rationing their canteens, each man limited to 2 mouthfuls every 4 hours. Dehydration made thinking difficult. Williams found himself staring at his compass for long seconds before the numbers made sense, a dangerous sign that his judgment was compromised. On the morning of December 18th, they located what appeared to be the headquarters complex. It was larger than anticipated, not a battalion command post, but possibly a regimental or even divisional headquarters. Williams counted at least 60 structures, most of them underground bunkers with reinforced overhead cover. Radio antennas sprouted from several locations. Armed guards patrolled in organized shifts. This was a significant find, potentially worth the risk of the mission. He directed Smith to set up the radio for a long transmission back to Nui Dat, encoding the coordinates and describing what they were observing. The transmission took 8 minutes, longer than Williams liked, but necessary to convey the detailed information command would need. He did not know that a VC signals unit was operating a radio direction finding station less than 5 kilometers away, specifically searching for Australian transmissions. The equipment was crude by Western standards, Soviet-made gear that could only provide a rough bearing rather than precise coordinates. But rough was enough. Within 30 minutes of Smith finishing his broadcast, a VC company was moving toward their approximate location with orders to find and destroy the Australian patrol. Williams had no indication they were compromised. The patrol remained in their observation position for another 4 hours, documenting the headquarters layout and patterns of activity. At 1400, he made the decision to withdraw. They had the information command needed. Staying longer only increased their risk. The patrol moved west, away from the headquarters complex, using a route Williams had already scouted for their eventual extraction. They covered 2 kilometers before Smith, walking rear security, heard something that made him freeze. Voices. Multiple voices. Coming from behind them and spreading out in a pattern that suggested a deliberate search rather than random movement. Williams assessed the situation in seconds. The VC were tracking them somehow, which meant their only option was to reach one of the extraction zones and call for immediate pickup. The nearest zone was 4 kilometers northeast, which would require doubling back toward the headquarters area they had just left. Not ideal, but the alternatives were worse. He hand-signaled the change in direction. The patrol increased their pace, abandoning stealth for speed. Every man understood what that meant. They had been compromised. The hunt was on. They moved through the jungle at a pace that would have been suicidal under normal circumstances, taking risks with noise and exposure that violated everything they had been trained to do. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew closer. The VC were not bothering with stealth either. They were moving fast, trying to close the distance before the Australians could escape. Williams did rapid calculations in his head. 4 kilometers to the extraction zone, maybe 90 minutes at their current pace. Then, however long it took for the helicopters to arrive once they called, the VC would be on them before that. They needed to slow the pursuit somehow, create separation, buy time. He made a decision that probably saved their lives. At a narrow stream crossing where the banks formed a natural choke point, he positioned Davis and another operator named Collins in a hasty ambush position. The 2 men would wait until the lead VC elements entered the kill zone, open fire, then withdraw immediately and rejoin the patrol. It was a delaying action, nothing more. The goal was not to win a firefight, but to create confusion and caution in the pursuers, make them slow down and reconsider their aggressive pursuit. Williams took the rest of the patrol and continued toward the extraction zone. They were 800 meters away when they heard the shooting start behind them, the sharp crack of SLRs followed by the heavier reports of AK-47s. The firefight lasted perhaps 40 seconds. Then silence. Williams stopped, waiting for Davis and Collins to catch up. 3 minutes passed. 5 minutes. They did not appear. Smith was on the radio trying to raise them. No response. Williams understood what had happened. The 2 men were either dead or cut off, unable to break contact and rejoin the patrol. He had 4 men now, and perhaps 50 VC hunting them through the jungle. The extraction zone was still 2 kilometers away. His radio operator was trying to reach the helicopters, but the weather had deteriorated. Low clouds and rain reduced visibility to near zero. The pilot's voice crackled over the radio with words Williams did not want to hear. They could not fly in these conditions. Earliest possible extraction would be dawn tomorrow, weather permitting. Williams looked at his remaining men and saw his own understanding reflected in their faces. They were going to have to survive the night with an enemy company searching for them, no artillery support, and limited ammunition. The jungle that had been their advantage was now a trap closing around them. Williams chose a position on high ground where a cluster of boulders provided some cover and good fields of observation in 3 directions. The 4th direction was a steep slope they could use for emergency withdrawal if necessary. It was not much, but in their situation, nothing would be much. The 4 remaining operators, Williams, Smith, and 2 others named Peterson and Murray, established a defensive perimeter in the fading light. Each man had perhaps 40 rounds of ammunition remaining. Smith had 2 grenades. That was their arsenal against an enemy force that outnumbered them at least 12-1. The rain started at dusk, a heavy tropical downpour that reduced visibility to almost nothing and turned the jungle floor into a slick mess of mud and rotting vegetation. Under normal circumstances, Williams would have considered the rain a blessing. It covered noise and made tracking nearly impossible. But these were not normal circumstances. His men were exhausted, low on ammunition, and facing a night in hostile territory with no prospect of extraction until morning. The rain just made them cold and miserable on top of everything else. They did not speak. Hand signals only, and even those were minimal. Each man understood his sector of responsibility and what would happen if the VC found them. They would fight until their ammunition was gone. Then they would run. There was no heroic last stand in the playbook, no fighting to the death for ground that meant nothing. The SASR doctrine was survival and mission completion, in that order. They had already completed their mission by transmitting the headquarters location. Now survival was all that mattered. The VC came at 2200, probing carefully through the darkness. Williams heard them before he saw them, the sound of equipment scraping against vegetation, the quiet voice of a leader directing his men. They were moving in a sweep line, trying to flush the Australians out of hiding. It was competent tactics, the kind of operation that worked against conventional forces. But the SASR had spent months training for exactly this scenario. They did not panic. They did not open fire prematurely. They simply waited, motionless in the rain, while the VC sweep passed within 20 meters of their position. The enemy patrol moved on without detecting them. Williams counted at least 15 men in that group, which meant there were probably others searching different sectors. The VC were being thorough, treating the jungle as a grid and clearing it systematically. Given enough time, they would find the Australian position. Williams checked his watch. 10 hours until first light. 10 hours until the helicopters could fly. They had to last that long. At midnight, the VC tried a different approach. Voices called out in English, accented but clear. Surrender, and they would be treated as prisoners of war. Continue fighting, and they would die in the jungle like animals. It was psychological warfare, an attempt to break the Australians' will through fear and the promise of survival. Williams knew the offer was meaningless. The VC killed prisoners routinely, especially Special Forces operators who knew too much about their tactics and dispositions. He did not respond to the calls. Neither did his men. They remained silent and invisible in the darkness. The rain stopped at 0200, and the jungle began its transition to the sounds of night insects and frogs. Williams used the ambient noise to shift position slightly, moving his patrol 50 meters to the northeast, where a fallen tree provided better cover. The movement took 40 minutes, each man crawling on his belly through the mud with infinite patience. By 0300, they were in their new position. 20 minutes later, they heard the VC moving through their old location, voices frustrated and confused. The Australians had vanished again. Smith tapped Williams on the shoulder and pointed to his radio. He had been monitoring the emergency frequency, and now there was traffic. 2 Huey gunships had launched from Nui Dat, despite the weather, responding to Williams's earlier distress call. They were inbound, but could not land in the darkness. However, they could provide fire support if Williams could mark his position and identify targets. It was something. Not salvation, but a tool they could use. Williams made a decision that reflected everything the SASR had learned in 6 months of operations. Instead of waiting passively for dawn, they would go on the offensive. Not a direct assault, that would be suicide, but a carefully planned strike designed to create chaos and buy time. He gathered his 3 men and explained the plan using hand signals and whispered words that barely carried over the sounds of the jungle. They would split into 2 teams. Williams and Smith would move toward the VC concentration they had heard earlier and engage at close range, firing a few rounds to draw attention. Peterson and Murray would be positioned 200 meters away, ready to call in the gunships on the VC response force when it moved toward Williams's position. It was desperate and dangerous, exactly the kind of operation that got men killed. But Williams understood they were going to die anyway if they remained passive. At least this way they controlled the timing and location of the engagement. At least this way they had a chance. They moved at 0430, with perhaps 90 minutes until first light. Williams and Smith crept through the jungle toward the sounds of VC movement, closing to within 30 meters before they stopped. Williams could see them now, shadows moving in the pre-dawn darkness. At least 20 men gathered in what appeared to be a command conference. Officers discussing search patterns and deployment. They felt safe this deep in their own territory, surrounded by their own forces. They had no reason to suspect that 2 Australian soldiers were close enough to hear every word. Williams aimed at the centre of the group and fired 3 rounds in rapid succession. Smith fired simultaneously, his shots directed at targets on the opposite side of the gathering. The effect was instantaneous chaos. VC soldiers dove for cover, returning fire in random directions, shouting orders that contradicted each other. Williams and Smith were already moving, sprinting through the jungle toward the extraction zone, while behind them the entire VC force converged on the contact area. Peterson, watching through night vision equipment borrowed from the gunships overhead, called in the strike. The Hueys came in low, their door gunners opening up with M60 machine guns that fired 4,000 rounds between them in less than a minute. Rockets streaked down from the helicopters, impacting in the VC concentration with explosions that lit up the jungle like daylight. The attack lasted 45 seconds. Then the gunships banked away, their ammunition expended, leaving behind a killing ground that would occupy the VC for hours while they dealt with casualties and tried to reorganize. Williams reached the extraction zone as the sun broke over the horizon. The weather had cleared enough for the transport helicopters to fly. He could hear them coming, the distinctive whop-whop-whop of rotor blades that meant salvation. The 4 SASR operators established a defensive perimeter around the landing zone, their remaining ammunition ready for one final fight if necessary. But the VC did not come. The gunship strike had broken their pursuit, at least temporarily. The helicopters settled into the clearing, and Williams's patrol climbed aboard. As they lifted off, he looked back at the jungle and thought about Davis and Collins, still out there somewhere, dead or captured. The mission had succeeded. The headquarters location had been transmitted. The enemy had been disrupted. But the cost was 2 men who would never go home. Williams closed his eyes and tried not to think about what he would write in his after-action report.